All right, let's, maybe I think we're almost ready to get started. So please come on in, find a seat. Welcome to the NYU Game Center lecture series. We're very excited to have Katherine Isbister with us here tonight. As always, big shout out to the sponsors who helped make the lecture series possible. Avalanche, Take-Two, Fresh Planet, and Dots. So thanks very much to them. I'm really excited to have Katherine here tonight. Katherine is actually this is welcome home, I'm going to say, because Katherine taught at NYU for many years. She was actually a member of both the School of Engineering and the NYU Game Center, kind of straddled both of those worlds, and was the person who was the founder of the Game Innovation Lab, and did a lot of really important work in both helping to kind of lay the groundwork for the great collaboration that happens between what is now called Tandon School of Engineering and the Tisch Game Center. And you know, when she was here, her work involved game design, engineering, research, and she is especially interested in the topics of social interaction, emotion, characters, and how those things relate to games and to technology. She's now continuing to do work along these lines at UC Santa Cruz in the Games and Computational Media program there, which, in my opinion, is kind of one of the handful of places that I look at as really kind of the leading edge of games research and education. I think they're just a fantastic program. So it's great to have her back. She's just written this terrific book, How Games Move Us, Emotion by Design, and she's going to talk about her research and work in this area. So please join me in welcoming Katherine Isbister.
What an amazing introduction. That guy is classy, I'm telling you. I'm going to talk about this book that I wrote, and this isn't an academic research book. This is a book that I wrote that's meant to bridge the territory between people who I presume, like yourselves, are very immersed in the world of game design, gameplay, and people who are befuddled, confused, alienated sometimes by what's going on with games, who tend to be dragged along by the media into the same old thoughts and conversations that I personally got sick of after seeing them go round and round on the merry-go-round. So, how many people have seen this ad? This is an old, yes. So this is an old chestnut. So from the beginning, people working in games have been interested in emotion, in trying to figure out how to create different kinds of feelings in people through gameplay. And this ad is maybe a little cheesy, but on the other hand, this was the beginning of Electronic Arts, right? Which is one of the major game companies of today. So, premising what they were doing on thinking about emotion and players wasn't necessarily a bad strategy. However, we had this kind of horrible moment, and maybe some of you are too young to remember. You're certainly too young to remember this moment. This is a 70s ad for Reese's peanut butter cups, and these people run into each other, and one of them has chocolate, the other has peanut butter, and they're like, "Oh my God, your chocolate's in my peanut butter, blah," and then they realize, "Ooh, it's really delicious." But there is this moment in game history where computing power got stronger, graphics cards got better, and Hollywood people started to get really interested in games, and games people started to get really interested in Hollywood, and not all of it was Reese's peanut butter cups. Some of it was maybe Peeps slathered in peanut butter and kind of grotesque and smarmy and overly sweet and disgusting and nothing you would really want to eat. And I think that unfortunately kind of soured some people who care about games on this whole question of emotion. But I do think that in the ensuing years, games managed to absorb cinematic techniques and start to work them into interesting experiences that also involve gameplay. So if you think of series like, Final Fantasy, Grand Theft Auto, maybe even Metal Gear Solid, there's a blending that's happening there. Sure, some people get tired of sitting through endless cutscenes, and it's not for everyone, but there's certainly a synergy and a synthesis happening. But these games aren't all about the cinematic techniques, right? They have absorbed and sort of taken them into what's happening with the gameplay, but that's not all that's there. And I would argue that it's similar to what happened with, say, early television. So when television first came out, people did these essentially live theater plays and ran them on television. And you would have to watch, and it would be for certain set hours, and it would be sponsored by Kraft or someone else. And it would be filmed just, as if you were at a live theater. And, if you look at sitcom TV today, it still has some elements of that live theater experience, but it's not like it's actually live theater. And we don't say that TV sitcoms are crap because they sort of look like live theater, and that's stupid. Why would anyone do live theater in television? It's become this hybrid thing, right? So I think we're kind of mostly past that moment, although it sometimes rears its ugly head again and again, this thing of, is that really a game, or is that like a narrative simulator? What is that thing? Is that, what are we doing here? And like I said, I think it caused a break-off of some set of the gaming community to sort of say, you know what, I don't want to deal with that at all. I want to think about the parts of games that are completely separate from those narrative-based emotional experiences. But I think that that's too bad, because that's been an oversimplification and it's kind of left a vacuum in understanding what's going on with games. And it's left a vacuum that the press can manipulate to talk in really broad and sort of ill-informed ways about what's going on. And I think part of the problem, too, is that we're not being trained as a society to think in complex ways about games as a medium, right? I mean, there's been this huge conversation lately about how everyone should learn how to code. But people also need to learn how to be literate about the media forms around them and to be able to unpack them and understand them from a design point of view, to figure out how they impact them emotionally and how to work with them, not just as a player or consumer of media, but also as a creator of media. So I think part of the problem is there are too few places like this, or like UC Santa Cruz, where people are getting a high degree of game literacy, essentially, to figure out and understand what's going on. So then what we get is this weird oscillation in the broader public about games that ranges from, there'll be games springing out of every math book. It'll be so amazing. Kids just love games. They'll be so inspired. They'll fall in love with them, and they'll do their homework, to, games are so horrible. They create like sociopathic, horrible people, and the children will rise up and murder us all. And, it's just like this, it's just, and I swear, you guys, ever since I started working in this field, it's the same conversation. It's the same loop. And it's like, So I think there's always going to be this kind of rhetoric in mass culture. I'm not saying that's ever going to go away, but I think it's kind of ridiculous that we haven't advanced past that in sort of more educated, cultured, sort of broad conversational contexts as a society. And so that is really what motivated me to write this book, because I've spent the last, 10, 15 years really diving in more from a design point of view and a research point of view into understanding, okay, how do games actually impact people emotionally? And what are the design moves that can be made that affect people, and why do they work? And I realized, while this is happening, this public discourse just never changes, and if I want it to change, I should really turn around and write something about it. So luckily, Jesper Juhl, who was here for a while as well, was one of the co-editors of this Playful Thinking series of books. And this is from MIT Press, and the whole idea was, do a short volume that launches an argument about games that gets, not just people who are in the inner circle of the game world, but also people who are, game curious to think about and understand some unique component of games. So I decided to write one of these. I thought, oh, it's short. It'll take no time at all. It took me 5 years, so just be careful. So there are a lot of emotions that games can provoke in people, can engender in people, and I chose in particular to focus on emotions around empathy and connection in my book. And that's not to say other types of emotions aren't really interesting and wonderful material to work with, but I chose these because I think that of all the stories you can tell about emotions in games, this is the story that so rarely gets told in a complex and interesting way in the general public. And I think it really hobbles our efforts as we create interesting new experiences for people that walk into that terrain because there's no narrative to support it. And so those things keep disappearing. So what I wanted to present tonight are some of the design strategies that I have seen in games that work with our emotions to create these sorts of feelings. So let me just start first with the building blocks of the argument in the book. So the first building block is recognizing what is unique about games. And if we think back to this perhaps apocryphal statement by Sid Meier, a good game is a series of interesting choices, right? The premise we have when we come to the game is we're going to be active, we're going to be making decisions. Those decisions, if it's a well-designed game, will have some meaningful impact on what happens to us, and that's the compact that we get into with games. So therefore, much of the emotional character of responding to a game has to do with this series of interesting choices. And one of the most popular theories that's been pulled from psychology into game design is this notion of flow that was originated with Csikszentmihalyi, this idea that there's an optimal state of consciousness that you get into when you have just the right degree of challenge. And if you notice, there are emotion words. This is actually a diagram that Genova Chen had in his his master's thesis, where he was exploring this from a game design point of view of trying to stay between these poles of anxiety and boredom, sort of managing somebody's flow into an optimal range. You can be frustrated sometimes, but then you feel elation, and then you might go back to frustration. It's not, it's a wiggly line. It's not like you're on a perfectly straight line. But in essence, this is a huge part of the emotional repertoire of games. And so when I'm explaining this to people who are not like yourselves, who don't know games really well, I try to say, you really have to think of games not so much as a medium like movies, but more like a sport. So even though, that crazy things. No, I really, thank you so much, Java. Fuck you, Java. Sorry, this is not recorded. Anyway, so this is the problem here. Like, you look at this and you don't necessarily, if you don't know it, think it's a sport, right? So I think people get fooled by the screeniness of games, by the fact that they are so similar over the shoulder to like cinema with visuals and audio and interesting variation in what's happening on the screen. But I say to them, no, it's really much more like a sport where somebody has goals and objectives and they're striving toward them, and therefore you feel different kinds of feelings. Like, similar to being in a race, for example, like you have a time you want to actually accomplish, you're speed running in a level, and if you don't get there, you're still frustrated. This is not the kind of thing that happens to you normally when, say, you binge watch a series on Netflix, right? Like, oh yeah, I went through that in record time, right? It's like that's not a part of the emotional repertoire normally of other media. So kind of from the get-go, games have this different repertoire. And so designers work with this. So they might take something like a marathon, and then, in the game, you finish and your time is the one you wanted, and we know this from the game state, and so crazy, like, juicy stuff starts to happen, and the crowd, like, cheers, and so game designers can heighten these moments of achievement of goals. And that's huge. From an emotional point of view, that's huge, because psychologists have this idea of appraisal theory of emotion, which is that our emotions are deeply tied to our goals and whether we accomplish them or not. So games automatically hook into this whole apparatus we have in our minds and our bodies for responding to whether we get something done we want to get done. And then some designers just make things really so hard you just have to laugh, right? They take it over into the absurd. Okay, so like that sort of ties to the sort of pure systems way of looking at games and how games function for people emotionally. But I still think it's good to overlay this emotional taxonomy and understanding onto the understanding of the systems. But there is another really, really important layer that I think has gotten kind of the baby thrown out with the bathwater in shying away from narrative. And that is people's social emotions. And I believe social emotions don't always only rely on narrative. So here's a quote from Will Wright. It pretty much has nothing to do with narrative. It's a response to an old school game. He says, people talk about how games don't have the emotional impact of movies. I think they do. They just have a different palette. I never felt pride or guilt watching a movie. And there's actually a story of him interacting with a very old game called Black and White Creature Isle. This game was kind of bizarre. It was like one of these early moral, like evolution type games, and you had this minion. You could choose these different animals, you know, and you would sort of, it was kind of horrible. You would sort of train it to be good or evil, and if you wanted it to be evil, you would basically be really mean to it until it became evil. So you know, he's the guy who made The Sims. He gets this game, and he like instantly starts slapping his creature, and then he feels like horribly guilty. He's like, oh my God, why do I feel guilty? I know it's code. Like, what is wrong with me, right? Like, that's just bizarre. Well, it turns out, I mean, so I got my PhD under this guy at Stanford who did this whole like 10-year line of study about this, that in fact, if something acts socially, you just automatically start to behave with it as if it's social, and all of those interpretive strategies in your brain fire off, and you just start working with it as if it was social, okay? So, and then nowadays, there's this other theory in psych of grounded cognition, which basically is that you read signals from your own actions to decide how you feel about something. So games trick you into taking actions, which then you start to label as your own beliefs, okay? So there's these very potent mechanisms happening in games that can impact how you feel and how you relate. So these are the two layers, the intersecting layers, and I want to just unpack 3 different design innovations that games have come up with that really take advantage of this stuff. The first one is the NPCs. So if you think about Creature Isle and what's going on there, one thing that games have brought us is non-player characters, essentially characters controlled by code that respond to us and travel with us through situations in a game. And this archetype in particular of like something that you take care of, it evokes like pets, it evokes your children, it's a very, very powerful trope. And in fact, you know, you see it coming up again and again. I mean, this game is a funny example because these cats really could give a crap about you, and you have to like buy crap. It's kind of like this horrible bad parenting model, but it still sort of works because it's working on your heartstrings in this interesting way. But pets aside and sort of casual games aside, I did actually do a survey with a student a few years ago about this question of, did a game ever make you cry? And every single example people gave, it was not playing a game with other people. It was actually an NPC that you'd bonded with over time. You'd gone through a lot of hardship with in a game, and then you lost them. Those were the moments that people described, even with text-based games, where they really bonded with this character, and then things fell apart, and they were very sad, and literally were crying while they were playing the game. So this is super powerful. This is an incredible medium in that way, I think. And I have an example in the book that I think is a really interesting sort of edge case for where this can go. So how many people are familiar with Japanese dating sims? Okay. That's a pretty good number, actually. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a sim in which you, as the player, are courting a fictional character and trying to get to the point where you're dating. And so some of you, your mind may look at, oh, wow, what happens then? You know, and certainly there are very explicit games like this, but there are also these very sort of dreamy, romantic versions of this. And this game, Love Plus, is an example of that. So essentially what happens in this game is there are 3 different girls that you meet, and they each have these qualities like, I think here, Nene, Monica, and Rinko. And so, one of them plays tennis, one of them's kind of an older sister type, one of them's shy. So you sort of have to figure out, all right, which of these people strikes my fancy as somebody that I might approach? And then the interesting thing about the game is you really have to work at connecting with this NPC. You have to learn things about the character and character's family. You have to show up and walk them from point A to point B. You can exchange texting information and start texting. And you essentially have 100 days in which to accomplish the goal of getting this character to be willing to be dating you. And then, once you actually are dating, there's an incredible range of content in the game related to that, like things like a map of the city where you can sort of choose what kinds of places you'll go on dates. And, if you go into a karaoke bar one time, your girlfriend might feel too shy to sing. Then if you go again, she might sing some more. And so there's this continuing progression of little intimacies. And I think this is a really fascinating example of how far this design innovation in games can go. And I think there's a lot more terrain in really pushing little moment-to-moment accumulative intimacy through NPC design. I think is a really interesting path to take, and not just toward relational intimacy, but understanding other people, getting a sense of who they are, working your way into a social situation, those sorts of things. But I think this game demonstrates that commercially this is viable even today, and it's astounding to me that people aren't more cognizant of how powerful NPCs as a design innovation are that have come out of games. So that's the first thing. The second one is the notion of the avatar, okay? So having avatars in games, obviously not all games have avatars, but having an avatar buys you so much in working with people's basic psychology. So first of all, if you have an avatar, you have like a physical vessel for what the person can actually do in the game. So it's like you've given them, like, when you're driving your car, you're sort of aware of how big your car is around your body. You're giving them this proprioception into being a different being in this world. And if you remember this grounded cognition thing, you're instantly able to make them feel lots of things simply by the visceral choices you're offering them and the feedback from the world. I have this like snowboard example here, just from the sound and kind of, the rumble in the controller, you can start to evoke a lot of feelings in people by narrowing that down. Then you've got this cognitive layer in the sense of the game mechanics, like what are the possible things that the person could do. That also carefully delineates for the player what sort of a creature they are, right? It could be Curse of Monkey Island and you're a detective who just relies on witty banter, or it could be Max Payne and you're relying on your gun, right? So constraining the choices of actions also helps to frame the emotional tone for someone. And then you're also offering them a kind of social mask behind which to relate not just to NPCs, but also to other people. So, you make them huge, you make them tiny, you make them female, you make them blue. All of those things change how they think about themselves and how they relate to other people. So avatars buy you a tremendous amount of control in terms of thinking about how people feel emotionally. So I'll just go over a couple of examples of games that I think are really clever. The first one is City of Heroes, which is sadly no longer with us, but I think this was an extremely clever MMO in that it took the fantasy of being superheroes and really brought it to life for players and did it in this really interesting way. So it took a sort of, hang on, I want to get this right. So I don't remember the exact, I'm having a hard time looking at my notes here, but basically it had a class system like all MMOs, and I'm not, oh shit. This is a techie person problem here. I don't know why this is not. We might have to recycle the, yeah, so I'll go on. Anyway. Yes? No? Anyway, essentially the game had a class system like any MMO, which you have, different types of roles players can take on. that are interrelated in terms of, oh, yay, in terms of fighting. And then there's a backstory for the kinds of powers that are layered onto those basic classes, which is sort of a core MMO thing. And those backstories, you could have become a superhero because of science, or you could have become a superhero because of magic, right? So these different sort of mythic tropes for how people become superheroes. And then that's also built deeply into the game mechanics. So you get to choose that, and then that shapes how you're going to progress in terms of your abilities in the game. But then after you're done with that, and those choices are tethered really tightly to gameplay, you get choices, a huge range of choices of your appearance. Like giant, tiny, you can customize the hell out of how you look. And then the last really astute thing they did is they let you have, it's so simple, but it's like pretty profound. They let you have this text box where you could enter your backstory. You could just like enter anything you wanted. And it turned out that was really a potent way to liberate people to tell crazy stories about themselves. So I want to read some of these. Sorry, I'm going to do this. Crap. I'm just going to take this out of here. How do we? All right. So, Melissa Kane, formerly a teacher in a school for superpowered children, now a revenant out for revenge. Thunderblitz, psychotic and omnicidal cyborg made from the DNA of a narcissistic supervillain, steampunk technology, and powered by an arcane reactor stolen from the Circle of Thorns. That other kid, Stuntman, who after too many knocks on the head believes that she's actually a superhero, runs around Paragon City waving a katana and quoting Quentin Tarantino movies. Swamp Fever, a scientist who merged himself with hallucinogenic swamp plants. Organized Mime, he was an evil mime who was super strong and awesome to play. And then the 100-Acre Hood, oh bother. I mean, right? It's like, you can't do that in any other I mean, this is basically, you get to play superheroes, you get to fly around, you get to actually become more powerful, and you get to customize this, and people would poke on, sort of look at each other's backstories and just have the best old time playing make-believe, like outside of the bounds of Paragon City. And they also had a lot of transmedia stuff backing up. But anyway, I think this is a very elegant example of clever avatar design. So when you get a social situation with avatars, you also tap into another thing about us humans, which is it's very satisfying and evolutionarily beneficial for us to work together, to closely coordinate together. And when you're watching media, you're not doing that. I mean, even though it's nice that you're here listening to me talk, you guys aren't really like doing stuff together. You're just like sitting really still. You're not using your bodies. Like you're not activating that. Like if we were all doing this while we were, say, skiing or like playing a game of soccer together, we would bond in a really different way because it would light up these parts of our brains that are all about close coordination with one another. And that's a lot of how we decide how we feel about people, just hanging out and doing things together. Like, have you ever pushed somebody's car with them? Get it started, you instantly like that person more because you like all worked really hard to do something. So games have this at their disposal, right? So for this example, I like to, so how many people know Little Big Planet? A lot of people, okay. So I think this game is really sweet, and then it sort of distills down this joint action and kind of creates this lovely, it sort of forces people into these silly vaudevillian relationships with one another. So for those who don't know the game, it's a puzzle game, and you solve these puzzles together, and you have a sack boy, this little avatar, and then you can customize it. And one of the neat things about it is you can control the facial expressions in some simple, very exaggerated vaudevillian style gestures, like you can smack one another and so forth. And you work these levels together, and interestingly, you can do this in person, or you can also do this over the network. But what happens for people when they're using these avatars is that they get really into the expressive capacity of the avatars, and they have these kind of side shows going on. So let me read you a quote from a player. So Helen calls them the hurrah buttons, L2 plus R2, both analog sticks held upward. Whenever she wins the most points on a Little Big Planet level, she presses these buttons, and her grinning sack girl lifts both arms in the air in wordless celebration. My sack boy, meanwhile, tends to scowl and storm off the side of the screen, fists clenched. Or after a particularly stressful level, he might pull out a frying pan and hit Helen's sack girl over the head. Helen tends to take losing slightly better. She will drag my sack boy away from the camera, mid-disco dance in a vain attempt to take the spotlight. Either way, nigh every level ends in a comical scuffle between our characters without a word spoken between us in the real world. And then the same writer notes that the controls allow for much richer nonverbal communication between the players. So he says, instead of Helen telling me to go over there and pointing to a corner of the television screen, Helen's sack girl herself points at a switch within the world, and my sack boy goes there. When he finds the wrong switch, sack girl shakes her head angrily and points again. This time my sack boy gets it right, and sack girl grins and gives a thumbs up. So the game designers here have given the players this really interesting alternate schema for communicating with each other, and they're choosing to do it even when they're in the same room so that they can play in the game world. And they very astutely delimited what can happen. I mean, there's not like full-on networked verbal chat going on in Little Big Planet, right? Which is great for kids because you don't want crazy stuff to go down. But I mean, so they've limited it down, and they encourage, therefore, this kind of slapstick silliness. So. And then the last game that I wanted to touch on that shows you sort of a different side of avatars is in coordinated action is this game that was built by Anna Antropy. And this was actually for Occupy Oakland. And it was called Keep Me Occupied. And so she developed this game to go in this custom-built console. And they were actually like kind of rolling it along. And the whole point of that day was they were going to storm and occupy this building, and then they needed something to do, so they were going to play the video game once they were there. No, I mean, so the way the game works is it's a simple gate mechanism that takes many players, and you sort of travel upward as you open gates. And each person, as they initiate an avatar, gets a very simple colored avatar. So yours is the green one, or the purple one, or the red one. And in the game mechanic, you can actually sort of choose to sacrifice part of your turn to open a gate so that somebody else who comes later can get further along in the game, right? So I think this is a really elegant, worked example of a game artist basically saying, okay, I'm creating something for this particular event, and I want people to reflect on what they're doing in a certain way. So I'm going to create this avatar appearance and also this game mechanic, this set of things the avatars can do that will sort of evoke that feeling of community and connection for people in the way that the game is played. So you can see, I mean, moving from City of Heroes to Little Big Planet to Keep Me Occupied, there's just these incredibly different choices about the nuances of how the avatars look, but also the abilities they have in the game world. And I think this shows that there's this incredible range of possibility for avatars. All right. So the last design innovation is sort of like, those drawings where you either see two faces or you see the vase in the middle. I think the last innovation is really the ground between the figures. It's the fact that, because game worlds, we craft them and we know so much about what's happening for the player, there's an opportunity to create a very highly socially meaningful situation for people. Put them in a situation that is going to, by its nature, evoke these potent social feelings and emotions, okay? So my first example of this is a game that you largely play by yourself, but occasionally you can connect with other people. So this is Animal Crossing, actually Animal Crossing New Leaf. And how many people played Animal Crossing? Okay, so a fair number. So in this game, it's kind of a funny game. It's a little sim-ish in that you wander around and you do jobs and you buy stuff and you chat with little villagers and you kit out your cute little house, and there's so many adorable things you can acquire, and it's and the villagers are really fun. But then they built in this feature where you could go and visit other people's houses, other people's villages, and say hi or send each other gifts. It sort of activated this extra social layer of the game. And there was this really lovely game review that a game journalist, Stephen Totillo, did that I think really gets at this notion of creating these socially meaningful situations. So he was getting an early sneak peek at the game, and he was getting a tour essentially from one of the makers. So here are his words. It had been raining in my virtual hometown. It was raining in Kyogoku's. More coincidence. I stepped off the train, and here were two of the game's creators as cute little Animal Crossing people. Kyogoku directed me to some objects outside the train station. They were at my feet. "I left you some gifts," she said. They were baskets of fruit. There was a present wrapped in a special wrapping paper. She encouraged me to open the gift. It contained carp streamers, a gift that only Japanese gamers were slated to receive from the game on Children's Day in early May. I'd never have unlocked it in my American copy of the game. We'd found ourselves a good bullet point. She suggested that players could benefit from connecting to gamers in other countries to get items offered only in those regions. This wasn't a mere tour, obviously. It was a friendly sales pitch with gifts. We all casually walked past a flag that just happened to have a Kotaku logo on it. Flattery. Later, they sent me a gift code to generate it. And then he goes on to describe the strange feeling of touring Kyogoku's own house in the game. We wound our way through the town. I kept snapping screenshots with my 3DS. We headed over to Kyogoku's primary home. She went inside. Eguchi stood by the mailbox. "Just go in?" "Yes," they told me. That was weird. Maybe because I'm a mere Animal Crossing dabbler, maybe because this felt weirdly intimate. It felt different than hanging out outside in the virtual rain. Yes, we were playing a game. They were clearly trying to hype its features and generate a positive story, but I suddenly felt like I was imposing. Homes are private places. Walking into another person's, particularly that of a person who made the game, felt like a big step. Of course, this wasn't really a home. I was just buying into the metaphor more strongly than I'd expected. So again, this is somebody who's incredibly sophisticated about games, but has this moment before he crosses the threshold into this person's house, right? And this very powerful feeling of, whoa, and also this mixed feeling about being given the gifts and, working through these social relationships. All right, so the last game that I want to mention is the game that's on the cover of the book. And I think this game does a really nice job of blending really astute avatar choices with very, very astute choices about creating a socially meaningful environment. And so, Genova has gone on record as saying he knew with this game he wanted to create a feeling of awe and smallness in people from the start, that he didn't want to create that usual game feeling of being all-powerful. So he's sort of working from this feeling he wanted to generate. And if you look at the environment and you're tiny, the environment is huge. Then if you look at the choices about the avatars are very simple. Unlike a lot of the other games I showed you, you don't get a lot of choice about how you look. You look the way you look, and the other character you come across looks very similar to you. So there's not really this emphasis on individuality and choice and accumulation. And then they did a really interesting thing. They also set a challenge for themselves of having civil and deeply connective interactions with other players in an online forum, which for people who have played anonymous online games, that can be a real challenge, right? People can go a little berserk in anonymous online territory and become really nasty to each other. So what they did was really simplify down even further than Little Big Planet, what kind of communication you could have to these little chirps and sort of moving around in the game world, and let the unfolding of the challenges in the game push you towards realizing you needed to collaborate with this other that you met along the way for your own good. So here's what one player said about the experience. "I stumbled across another player in the beta second area identical to me with no visible username or real method of communication. Using our ability to let out one-note chirps, however, we were able to gain an understanding of each other. We chirped so we wouldn't lose each other. We touched in order to keep each other's jump ability powered up. We ran across the desert together while chasing flying carpets. The world of Journey is stark, dead, and lonely despite its eerie beauty, and that made me want to stick with my new companion all the more. Sliding down a dune with a new friend next to me, chasing carpets. It was magical, to say the least." So I think that is a nice marriage of the figure and the ground. It's sort of really great choices about avatars, and then really great choices about delimiting the possibility space and setting up what will then very likely be an extremely powerful emotional experience. Not for every player, but for a lot of players. And none of that stuff is inherent to narrative, right? That stuff is all coming out of gameplay with an astute awareness of our social senses and how we respond to things emotionally from a social point of view. So I hope that I have convinced you that these are profound design innovations that games have brought to the table. What I'm hoping with this book is that I will also convince people in the broader public and get them to start talking and thinking in a different way about what's happening in games, and encourage them to go off and play and have interesting experiences that lead them out of this sort of weird feedback loop we have when we discuss emotion in games. And that's all I have tonight, so thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right.
So, yeah, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and we'll open up to the audience for some Q&A. But before we do, I just wanted to ask you a couple of things. That was great.
Thank you.
And I guess I'm sitting there, I'm listening to your talk, and it occurs to me that I'm not even sure I understand what emotions are. I'm sitting like you're kind of going through, and I'm kind of following along, and then at a certain point, so a question occurred to me, which is in the course of your research and your work, have you looked into is there a broader science of emotion coming out of, I guess, psychology or even sort of evolutionary psychology and behavioral science? And have you ever looked into that? And does that inform your work at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done a lot of work on emotion and how people relate to technology. And one of the interesting things is a lot of the study of emotion it's kind of like Linnaeus creating a taxonomy of the animals. Mm-hmm. Like psych people who categorize emotions, they're looking, and I think it's partly because they have statistical techniques that allow them to arrange words in structural terms. So there's this whole like universal emotion stuff that comes out of Ekman, and then there's this arousal and valence model of emotion, but they don't necessarily capture conflicting, moving emotions in a dynamic way. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of interesting gaps in that core research, I would say. Maybe one of the most relevant things to game design is this realization that psychologists and neuroscientists had, that approach and avoid are two parallel systems. So like you can simultaneously be very drawn to something and very repelled by it. And to me, that helped to explain some of the contradictory emotions people will have, strong feelings towards, strong feelings against. So I guess what I would say is it's surprisingly not as helpful as you would like to delve into that literature to be able to articulate what's going on in games.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems like one of the things that emotion represents is those aspects of our conscious experience which we are not in control of, right? And as opposed to the things that are more conscious and deliberate about our behavior, our emotions create a context in which we are confronted with our sort of autonomous identity, that our reactions to things, our kind of built-in, the sort of ground, the sort of fundament on which our more conscious behavior sits. And I think it's a really interesting contrast, especially in games, because I think a lot of the interest in emotion, like the way Genova talks about it, is that these things are kind of opposed to each other, right? On the one hand, you have the things that games were traditionally known for, which are about logical problem solving and sort of conscious, deliberate attempts to achieve a goal, versus, I don't know, values, right? The more humanist qualities that we get from other forms, like
I think it might be the goals. Like I think there's like individual goals and thinking through things, and then there are like brain and body goals that people have, and then there are social goals people have. And I think games allow for social simulation as well as like cognitive simulation, where you're working through a problem. So working through a problem still creates some feelings, right, around getting there or not, like frustration, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
When you get the body involved, then, as I was saying, you get these bottom-up sensations that our brain is like trying to label as feelings, right? So, and
Right.
even with like a Twitch game, you know, if you can't stay calm, you know, if you get overwrought,
Sure.
you know, you're reading anxiety in your body from, you know, you've got this feedback loop going, right? And then all the way to the other end is we have these basic hardwired social goals. Like we want to get along with the tribe, you know what I
Right.
mean? We don't want to offend the chief, you know? Like these sorts of things, you know, are just very knee-jerk in us.
Right.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, what do you think? What is it about the last 5-10 years that has caused an evolution in the way that we are looking at video games, especially that we're paying more attention to this broader range of emotions? Is it is it something technological that's happened? Is an evolution in the technology and their representational kind of simulational qualities, or is it something else that's going on that's opening them up?
I think we become enamored of different corners of the game space. Like I think if you think of like Planetfall or like text adventure games, some of them were very emotional, right? I think it's
That's right,
like, you know, or you think of, you know, the adventure games, you know, they were kind of witty and had this certain like la 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 kind of da 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 da, you know, different kinds of things going on. And then I think that maybe we go through phases where we're really interested in things like spatial puzzles or, you know, so I just think it's all there. It's a design space that's been there. It's just, I do think maybe one thing that's happened is the tools are getting into more hands in the last 5 years. And so more people who have more different ideas and a broader terrain of the game design space are starting to make stuff, right?
Right.
So.
And you think that is kind of like leading to people exploring a wider range of kind of tonality or,
And also that you can get it out there, but I still think that's a struggle. I actually think the other thing that I've been trying to work on with the book is like getting people who like have these ideas of what games are, which are only a subset of what games are, to go, oh, wait, there's all these people who've made these beautiful things and they're sitting there on Steam, and please, would you go buy that thing?
Right.
Because it's already been made. You know, it's there.
Like,
you know?
Like what? Are there any examples that come to mind of things that are getting overlooked?
No, I mean, they're not overlooked by us, right? I mean, you can look at things that win at IGF every year, you know, like something like Her Story, right? Which is this kind of cool experimental narrative thing. My stepfather had never heard of that, and he loves mysteries. Like, he would totally enjoy playing it. It's just, you know, it's that finding that intersection of audiences and forums.
Yeah. One of the things that most of the examples that you give in your book, or maybe all of the examples that you give in your book, are use technology in some interesting way, or video games, computer games. But is there something different about computer games and video games and games that use technology and traditional games like sports and board games and other? Is there a difference there? And you know, why are you focused more on the computer side?
Well, I mean, I think that I come out of this human-computer interaction train, which like the point of inquiry is, what do we do with technologies as humans to make our experience more interesting?
Right.
But I definitely think that, I mean, Csikszentmihalyi, like, he was talking about non-digital games when he said games are astute flow machines, essentially.
Yeah.
And, you know, I do have Brenda Romero's Train game in the book. That's like the one, you know, non-digital example. But I don't think it's unique to games. I think the thing about technology is it's like magic. Like, we can use it to augment and enhance and create hyper stimuli. Like, we can make a big baby-eyed crazy character that looks like the cutest puppy you ever saw, and like it behaves just the way, you know, the most idealized puppy you would ever want to pet behaves, right? And that's kind of harder to do. So it allows different types of designed experiences, I suppose.
I mean, I guess in my mind, I always think, when I think about games and crying, I always picture Roger Federer winning the Wimbledon Open and standing there in front of the Queen of England with tears streaming down his face. This very handsome man just weeping on television in front of the Queen of England. For some reason, that's like this weird image. And I always think like like you're watching a human experience the most intense emotions possible. This person is being ripped apart by a kind of joy, but it's like a tragic joy because he's he's sacrificed his life to hitting a ball.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And here he is, and it's like, and he's just like, what am I? You know? And I think that's emotion at
You're
the
not
most.
reading anything into this.
You know what I'm saying? That's emotion at its most intense. Like there's no art form on the planet that can produce a more intense emotion.
Yes.
Our hearts go out to him. We feel empathy at the same time. Yes. And yet, for Genova Chen, that's just a bunch of junk, right? Because it's just. Right? I mean, is there something, what's going on there? There's something weird.
I think that's just a non-intersection of worlds, and I think part of that is that people who traditionally made video games were not really that into their bodies, and so there was this inherent, like, oil and water, like, little tension there, which I think is starting to go away. I mean, I think all the movement platforms, I mean, you can make fun of them, but there's some interesting genres that arose out of those, and I think that's going to continue. You know, like, some of the work we do, you know, looking at like technology instrumented LARPs where people are running around doing crazy stuff.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And like having moments.
Some of those LARPs are so intense that part of the design culture of LARPs is like getting people into the experience and then afterwards helping them get out.
Yes.
Helping them decompress. Talking through the emotions. There's a sub-genre of LARP called Bleed. I don't know if you're familiar with Bleed, but Bleed is specifically about doing this live-action role-playing kind of theatrical experiences that intentionally go beyond where people are comfortable.
Wow.
So you'll be surrounded by people like calling you fat, you know, and yelling at you and insulting you. Yeah, it's horrible.
It sounds like a hazing ritual at a fraternity.
It is. It's like a weird. Yeah, it is. It's like it's a kind of a strange avant-garde. You know, it has I think elements of kind of 60s happenings and encounters.
Right.
You know, and yet I think that it's interesting because there's an intersection of that with design culture. It's like what you're talking about. What's interesting here is the fact that there's raw stuff, you know, the stuff of human experience, the stuff that of like mucus and tear ducts and pheromones and adrenaline, then meets the kind of I don't know, this kind of structured thinking of designers, but also the structure of computers, right?
Yeah.
Logic and circuits.
Yep.
And I don't know, it's weird stuff. I mean, you deal, how am I going to approach this question? So you talked about the tradition of people who typically make computer games, or did for a long time.
Yeah.
And there is a kind of sense, like part of what's swirling around in this whole question of emotions and social interaction and computers is that it's not what we are known for as a community.
Yeah.
Emotional intelligence, social skills.
Right.
It's not our long suit, or not traditionally. And there's different ways of thinking about that. So I don't know if you've encountered, have thought about that issue at all, in the people you teach and the people you work with?
I think part of it is like, you feel it's partly, you know, like being beleaguered. It's sort of like, okay, I value this form, other people don't. And you band together and, you know, you stand up for the thing that you make. And then there's a strange thing that happens when the tent gets bigger and other things start to happen where you can just feel like, ew, who are those people and why are they in my tent, right?
Yeah.
And I sort of feel like you can have two reactions to that. You can either like, you know, like take your toys and go somewhere else, or you can be like, oh, kind of cool. That one's cool. I don't know about that one. You know, you can start like working a new. You
can also say,
you know.
It's a weird tent.
It is weird. I agree.
Dude, it's a weird tent. Because you talk about the guy in, I guess, Singapore who marries one of those.
Yes.
One of the fictional characters in that dating game.
Which kind of, I think, was like a press stunt.
It must be.
I don't think he really.
So that's maybe a little art project that he did.
Yeah.
But it's an art project about a thing.
Yes.
And the thing is that there are dudes who are doing that, and it's not an art project, right? There are dudes who have relationships.
Well, look, but like media.
And I'm not trying to other them also, because I grew up, I played D&D, and part of what appealed to me about that was, here's a world in which emotions are governed by logic. My ability to seduce someone is determined by a set of rules, and then I roll dice, and there's comfort there. You know what I'm saying?
Well, there's also randomness, but I think this gets right back to what media are supposed to do for us, which is essentially emotions are messy and they're painful, and it's like you never master them. I mean, I have a 9-year-old, and it's like it's easy to teach them how to like go to the potty. It's hard to teach them how to deal with their own anger. Like we spend our lifetimes managing our feelings, like not blowing up at other people or like getting hurt and then getting back in the game, whatever. So I think it's a form of catharsis, and some people like need a different kind of catharsis than others, like we are coming from different places. So I don't know, and that's what kind of annoys me about the sort of like dystopian discussions about games and kind of otaku people. It's like, it's no different than burying your nose in a book for 10 years, like to deal with a difficult childhood. It's like, and so, I mean, I think it's better to own it and kind of use it as material. I guess that's kind of my point.
Amen. Yeah, no, I agree. I think there is a sense in which, we have to own it and be aware of, there's cognitive diversity, there's emotional diversity, there's not everyone is built the same way in terms of how it's true that now that I'm thinking about it, at the same time as escaping into D&D, I was also escaping into books for similar reasons, because I had trouble interacting with people.
And look what you became. Like,
and
that
look what I
wasn't
became.
so bad.
So suave, so debonair. So what is your 9-year-old like to play? What games does your 9-year-old play?
Oh God, she's really into. Well, first of all, she does like all the girly ones, like the nail painting and stuff. But like she's into this game. You guys would know it. It's like a tunnel where you keep flipping and you're going deeper into the tunnel. I can't think of the name
is it
right
an
now.
endless runner? Is it the?
Yeah. I think that's it. I think that that one might be too hard. It's like that, but it's 3D. It's like a just.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
It's an iPhone game or an iPad game.
She's playing it on the computer.
She's playing it on the computer.
I don't know. I'll have to ask her.
Abstract.
Yeah,
3D.
it's very abstract.
You're going in and you're like trying to hit things and target.
There's like little.
Like a 9-year-old showed this to me like a while ago.
It's traveling in her circle.
I don't think we're part of this scene, but I have seen this game.
Yeah. Anyway.
And it's a little bit like an endless runner. It's very abstract.
Yeah.
So does she have emotion? Have you seen her have emotional reactions to games? Is there anything did you ever see her like have a flip out or rage out or anything that makes you worried? Are there negative things ever that happen?
No.
Did you ever get caught up in games in ways that concern you?
Not so far.
Okay.
I mean, we worried about that. We got an iPad for her and we policed how long she played with it. Then we realized she's not the kid that plays all day.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Yeah.
So far not.
That's great.
It could happen.
That's great. I wanted to ask about one of the things that happens in this whole topic is when people say that they want games about human relationships, about honor and dignity. Clint Hawking will say, why can't we have games about honor and games about dignity instead of just games about rope? You know what I'm saying? If we can simulate the physics of rope.
Yeah, why can't we simulate dignity?
We make games about these other things. But really, when people say that, they are talking about simulations, right? What they're saying is that, why can't we have a game that simulates these things? Mm-hmm. Because in fact, there's lots of games that are about honor and dignity. I mean, you can play World of Warcraft, and if you don't show up for your raid group on time,
then you're lame.
Then you've let them down, and that is about honor, and you're ashamed, and that is about dignity.
Yes.
But they're not saying that, right? What they're really saying is that they want games in which the representational layer, somehow the simulation layer, is about characters having emotional experiences, and then somehow it's like. So, whereas in your book, I think a lot of your examples avoid that trap, right?
Yeah.
You have tons of examples of games in which it's just people on their own interacting with each other, and it's kind of a direct experience. But have you encountered this before? This sense in which what people are really looking for is the simulation of these things, right? The representation, like the movie-like representation.
Well, they want that thing that you spoke of earlier with Love Plus, which is like the sense that the world makes sense socially. Like the dating sims are really interesting because they sort of take you through what could be an orderly process in which if you do well, you're rewarded. It's like a world that makes sense. And I think, it's really hard to craft situations with non-player characters where there's a nuanced progression like that makes sense, that emerges organically out of gameplay. I mean, I think it's a super tough AI challenge, basically.
Huh.
It's like you either have to like create infinite states. I mean, and all these like good, bad morality games are just crap because they just do it sloppily, and it's like, it's like there's nothing more nasty and sour than like false evil, noble, it just makes you just start pissing on the system. You're just like, ugh. You can't maintain your...
Because of the mismatch between...
Yeah, you're just like, ugh,
subtlety of actual morality and the way they try to rigidly
Well, and
fit
maybe,
it.
I think like flirting is this hesitant kind of give and take where the NPC has a lot of leeway, whereas like honor and dignity, you're just charging right in. So part of it may be that like the extra agency of the player makes that challenge a lot tougher from an AI point of view.
So it's in some ways they're saying, we want this higher design challenge, but you're also, I think, what your answer is kind of hinting at is this idea that they also want it explained in a way. To put it within the context of a fiction or a simulation or a story is a way of like giving insight into honor and dignity, whereas actual games where you actually experience honor and dignity are every bit as confusing and messy as the real world.
Yes, they are. Well, it's like, and then you have community managers who are constantly policing that and kind of like figuring out these backstory things and interventions to keep that from running off the rails, right?
Right.
But it is messy. You don't know what's going to happen. I think they want that like single player mode noble quest.
Right. Where it's given a kind of rich context that gives them insight. It's almost like in AI, there's this conflict whenever we solve things in a black box way with like this, deep learning neural networks. There's a kind of disappointment because people want, if there's some kind of AI breakthrough, they want it to then reveal some deep truth about cognitive. Instead of just, this is, or at least it works, but we don't know why.
A flexible model you could use again instead of having to retrain something.
So let me ask you, say one last question, and I'll open it up to the crowd, which is about, so this kind of gets at the same question of simulation, so in a video game, when you jump, that's a real jump. It's a jump. A jump is a jump. A point in a video game is an actual point. There's no confusion about that. A dragon in a video game is fictional. It's imaginary. It's made up. Where on that spectrum between real and imaginary or fictional do you think emotions like lie? So for example, in fear, if I'm playing Resident Evil and I'm afraid, is that real fear, or is it a version of fear that's kind of fake?
Well, it's a blend. It's a blend because, like advertisers can roll a sausage at you and you orient because something's coming at you.
Right.
And that is an immediate real thing, just like the jump.
Okay.
Something's coming at you.
Okay.
Okay. But then overlaid onto that is this sort of chimera of the ghost, which, again, like depending on how it's illustrated, it may have features. If it looks zombie-ish, like a creepy half-dead person that might be contagious, that's also like a super hardwired in the now response. You're like, oh God, that thing might get me sick. Yeah,
that's genuine disgust.
Yeah, but it's playing with we know at the same time we're sitting at a screen.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And with the jump, you're not actually jumping too. It's just I think maybe the problem is we're too contaminated in our thinking about traditional media to be able to pick apart this real time realness, in a sophisticated way. So
it's almost like there's this, they're blended together. It's like a double consciousness or something where, and I think that becomes especially interesting and hard to understand when it comes to things like cooperation and betrayal. Because there's some games that we play where we backstab our friend.
Yeah.
And the whole fun of that is the fact that we don't actually dislike our friend. We love our friend.
Yes.
And we're experiencing this strange emotion of doing something bad, but it's not really bad.
Yeah.
It's such a weird, conflicted
and
thing.
And then how do you hold the circle around that? Because sometimes people manipulate one another through gameplay, right? So then there's that extra layer of, is he doing that because he's mad at me today?
Yeah.
And like he's particularly viciously attacking me because he kind of needs to work off some steam instead of being mad at me? Like there's layers and layers when it gets into the social aspect.
And at the end of every season of Survivor, they sit around and some of the people, there's this argument about whether Survivor is theater in which the morality of your actions are inverted, where it's like, no, backstabbing you because that's what you do in a game. It's the opposite of what I am as a person. Versus, no, the game is like a lens that reveals the true you. You actually are an evil person. Well, and they have this little debate about ontology,
Well, and there's a horrible third possibility, and this is where people are really still chewing on this, which is that to a certain extent, if you inhabit in an act an attitude, you do acquire it to some extent. And there are studies to that effect. So this is a queasy spot with games is, to the extent that you're figuring yourself out bottom up, like how much of a residue is left in you after that experience, right?
This is what makes things so tricky, Catherine, I really think, because in painting, we're used to the fact that, listen, if I paint this horrible act, like Guernica, I'm Picasso, I'm painting this horrible act of war, it's not because I like war.
No.
I'm not getting my jollies about, I'm demonstrating my attitude about war by creating this inversion, because it's a representation of it. But in games, it's not quite that simple. You would like to be able to say that, Grand Theft Auto is precisely the same thing. We're able to frame these violent acts, these antisocial acts, within the fictional context. But you're saying it's not quite that simple, right?
Because it's so funny that you mentioned Grand Theft Auto, because I had this moment. I was playing GTA for a while, and I was coming to a stoplight that was turning red, and I had this moment where I was like, I'm just going to blow through this. And I was like, and I was like, oh my God. It was like this impulse. I mean, I didn't do it, but it kind of creeped me out. I was like, what? And I mean, that's not, that's just the mundane, realish stuff that's going on in the game.
But I love that you said that, because I think it's something that as researchers, as designers, as players, and kind of advocates, we often forget how subtle and complex this issue is. And maybe this is reminding us that Guernica should make us understand in a more nuanced way how Grand Theft Auto works, but by the same token, what you're describing, which I believe I have experienced too, should also help us understand Guernica a little bit better. And maybe to a certain degree, he is getting his jollies, right? To a certain degree, we do enjoy seeing animals blown up. It's weird, and we should just own it. There's a part of it. It's complicated. It's not. We're not angels. It's
catharsis and containment. Because I think the other thing is it's a way to exercise pieces of ourselves we're not comfortable with. Media. I think media allow people a safe space to do that. So
catharsis and containment. Ooh, I love it. I love it. Let's open it up to the audience and see if there's any questions. Yes.
This isn't so much a direct question. It's just asking for your thoughts on a topic.
Sure.
Bothering me for a long time. A criticism that I see leveled at a lot of games that gave me emotion and seem to have for a lot of people is that they're being manipulative, that they aren't legitimate, that it's not real. Something recently was Undertale. A lot of people say that game manipulates you into feeling for its characters. So, as a designer, as somebody who's making experiences, how do you navigate that boundary between really, wanting to give people an experience versus just making them have an experience?
Well, I mean, I think it kind of ties into what Frank was talking about earlier about the cognitive mastery of a situation, and then there really are these hot buttons. In music works really well on people, right? There are things that just go straight to your, limbic system and kind of get you, and you can feel a little manipulated by that. So, and I think part of it is the contract the player has going into the game with the game. If you want to feel that and you're excited to feel that, you don't feel manipulated. You went there because you want to feel that way. So I think sometimes it's a mismatch between the player and the experience. They feel like they got taken for a ride they didn't want to be on. But I think the other thing is, ideally, just like a bad movie that just gets really schmarmy because you're crying, but you're also stupid date movie. You feel manipulated. I think it's there's a subtlety with which you dance with the person having the experience so that they arrive at that place and it has a sense of integrity to it, right? Yeah.
Cool.
This is actually a question that is on the field question that Frank has been asked. Since you have explained that the fear, the emotion is the instinct, the real and fake is blended. Right? And my question is that about the example that you have already brought is like in Love Plus, right? The player really feel like love for that character, for that non-player.
Yeah, yeah.
To what extent is that real or
Right.
that fake? Because this is not like a horror game, right?
Sure.
It's not about the instinct that something is showing on the screen. You're
Right.
Like, whoa, no.
Yeah.
It's not that kind of emotion. And
Yeah, no, I think I think Love Plus is interesting because it unfolds over time, and I think one of the cooler things, I didn't even talk about that in the talk, is you can be with a game for hours and hours and hours and hours. You can be with a game in these quiet little meditative moments. You're giving so much of your time. I mean, think about the people you spend time with. You might spend more time with that game than with somebody you're really close to, and so there is this opportunity to create this funny, like, connection that is real in this sense. It isn't just that knee-jerk instant thing. It's maybe like, it's like a ghost limb of a relationship. You know what I mean? You know it's not real, but still you have these little memories, and maybe, you reflect on them years later. Oh, remember that time when whoa, that was the game character. I mean, I think that can really happen, right? So it is funny territory.
And so I really enjoyed that you're in the book, the exploration of Love Plus, which is a genre that a lot of academics just don't pay attention to,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And a lot of people who are interested in these issues,
Yeah.
For whatever reason, I think that because there's like a class thing, or it's just considered like for a different audience that they're not interested in,
Yeah.
there's a huge audience, there's a huge community of people who play visual novels
Yes.
and games of this kind that are exploring and very few treatments of it.
Yeah,
so
no,
it's
it's-
quite interesting in English.
English, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, right here.
Do you think developers are, I guess, morally wrong for kind of like tailoring these experiences to kind of like make you feel these intense emotions of sadness or anger, or like instilling their morality, their like beliefs on the players?
Well, I mean, we're not in Clockwork Orange where your butt's in a chair and your eyeballs are propped open, right? I mean, you get a choice. I mean, I think part of what's been going on, a lot of the anger in the game community and kind of contestment of territory has to do with like that social contract of what kind of an experience do I expect when I come into gameplay, and like finding strange things in my closet, like, oh, I don't think that's a game, and so I sort of think it sorts itself out because people choose. I think that the bad moments happen when people stumble into something that they weren't ready to handle, or that, wasn't at all what they were looking for. Because, we use media a lot of the time to unwind, to relax. Like, we want to have a predictable emotional experience. So we don't particularly like it when something, knocks us on our ass and we were already depressed. It's like, I hate that shit. You know what I mean? So I think it has a lot to do with, what you're expecting coming in, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, right here.
Do you think there's a place for video games formally in the field of psychology? For example, as an alternative to giving children medication, or to alleviate the symptoms of people who are struggling with mood disorders?
Yeah, I mean, games are definitely used to manage pain, for example, and they're used to work through PTSD. So there are definitely applications. I mean, you can titrate emotion in situations that people need to process. So I think that's definitely the case. I mean, yeah, I don't know, maybe for mood management. I sort of feel like, though, that's like an interface with reality problem, so games might or might not help. Do you know what I mean? Like, ideally what you want to do is work through that in real situations so you can feel better. But I'm not a psychologist. What do I know?
Yes, sir.
To me, it's hard to come to a conclusion about when a game, if you play like, every day for like 6 hours a day, what exactly the positive byproduct is of playing a game like that. It's like, just to make the obvious analogy with like sports, if you do that for 6 hours a day, I mean, the positive byproduct there would, for example, be that you're physically healthy doing so. So my question would be just if you can measure that byproduct,
Yeah.
what would it be?
Well, so one thought that I've often had is, kids play games because grown-ups are office workers sitting in front of computers. And kids are kind of hardwired to learn the right skills so when they grow up, they can do that stuff. And that's what we do all day. So I sort of think like we've evolved this symbiosis where games are kind of training kids to be very agile knowledge workers. I mean, and then if you look at, I mean, there's this woman, Daphne DeBavier, I think is her name, at Rochester, who accidentally found that games train this incredible like peripheral vision and coordination in people, which, what do we need that for? Well, maybe we need it to create even more dynamic information flow interfaces to manage the complex data sets we've created that help us run our society. I don't know, but you know what I'm saying? It's like we craft these tools, and then I think our play starts to reflect those tools to get us ready for being in the society.
Nice. Yeah.
You mentioned that, like thus far, the public discourse with respect to what video games are and what they can be hasn't really changed a whole lot. In the way that like comic books and movies have kind of distanced themselves by using terms like
Graphic novel. Yeah.
Do you think video games need this other term so that we can change the paradigm approach to which the way the public looks at it?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. When I write grant proposals, I've basically been told not to use the word game in writing government grant proposals because there's a senator that does a keyword search for grants funded with the word game in them and then publicizes them as wastes of taxpayers' money. So terminology means a lot in the research world. Oh God, I can't remember. You could find him online. He's just
What term do you use?
highly interactive digital simulation, stuff like that, right? No, but I don't know. I think I'd rather people embrace game in the game world and kind of get more groovy with each other about what it could mean. But who knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, it does seem that there's been a swing back towards just embracing the word game. I mean, there was a time, even, early on, with that ad you showed, the EA ad,
Yeah.
there was a sense of, let's call it interactive entertainment to distinguish
Yes.
it from
Yes.
tennis and chess and
Yeah.
and things like that. And now, you're right. I think there seems to be a sense, let's just call it games because
Yeah.
that's what we want to call
And
it. So-
honestly, it's a generational thing. The thing with the government funding is most of the people who are complaining, those senators, they're all like, 60 plus, and they didn't grow up
That's
with
not that-
games. They
that's not
don't.
that
I know. I'm just saying they don't.
not that old.
I didn't say it was that old. I'm just saying they don't know like what games are.
I agree.
Unlike some of
I
us.
agree. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, what would you say about using a game in an educational way to change or like teach kids to give in a way, like to be more giving to each other?
Yeah, I think that's something games can definitely do, because it's a great thing because games incorporate behavior and sort of practice behavior. But I think that you run into design challenges where you need to align your idea with the actual like mechanics in a procedural rhetoric fashion to make sure you're like what was that game where you had to try to survive as a poor person that backfired? Come on,
Right.
somebody knows. Spend it like made some people less empathetic after playing it. They're like, well, they're just stupid. If they were smarter, they'd manage their money better. And they walked away from this game about poverty thinking that poor people were dumb, which was not the intent of the game. So it's like a little like playing with fire. You got to be careful that the design really delivers the message.
It's funny, in a way, the unintended consequences are one of the clues that you are, in fact, dealing with a game. That is one of the things that games seem to be best at, is tricking or like being surprising and,
Absolutely.
and hard to predict.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's very true.
So, yes. Yes. David.
My question is, do you think different levels of immersion can tap into different palettes of emotions? I'm a little bit skeptical of VR, but I think what is interesting in it to me is that it appeals to like it makes me feel. It makes my body like react in like a really weird way. So like when I look down and this thing is forcing me to go to an edge, it makes my body feel like, oh, I might die.
Yes.
And that's
Yes.
really interesting to me.
Yeah, well, like VR gets your peripheral vision. Peripheral vision is huge and also takes away your sort of ambient stereo sound. Like when you play a game with speakers, you still are hearing all those things in the room, but it sort of strips that away, and that makes it much more viscerally potent as a medium. I mean, but it limits it because you can get sick lickety split, right? And there's a lot of weird challenges to VR, but it definitely puts people in the moment in an oddly visceral way. So I think that controllers and the way that games work with senses have a huge impact on their emotional palette.
Have you done any VR stuff? Any experiments?
No,
or-
I haven't
yeah.
been building. Essentially, I was kind of like VR avoidant
Yeah.
because I really like people to be in their bodies
Mm-hmm.
with one another. But I was at this conference a couple weeks ago, this versions thing that Killscreen ran, and I played with a lot of stuff heading into it, and I sort of realized, oh, this thing that we were just talking about now, like, it's kind of worth it sometimes to take away someone's, it's sort of like sensory deprivation tanks, or like
Yeah.
sitting on a dark stoop with a friend in the summer and you talk about everything under the sun because you can't see each other. Like, I think there's a potency to controlling those senses, but it has to be used very carefully.
Interesting.
So.
Interesting. I think we have time for one or two more. So yes, right here.
Right, so lately I've been seeing a lot of game-making games, like Mario Maker.
Mm-hmm.
You think there are some experiences that making a game can get you that playing one cannot?
I mean, making anything. I think making anything can be an interesting emotional experience, but I'm not sure making games is unique in the realm of making stuff. So.
There's a sense in which when it comes to games, there's an even closer relationship, I think, between the mind of the designer and the mind of the player, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree that there's
Yeah,
a sense in
yeah,
which
I see what you mean.
you're watching a film, you're not as aware of how it's put together, where often
Yes.
playing a game
Yes.
involves reverse engineering it in your head.
So,
you
so
know?
watching people play the game you made, then
Uh-huh.
I think can cause interesting emotional experiences, if that makes
Interesting.
sense. Like once the thing's running and you're like, oh my God, what? You did what? You know, and just
Yeah.
seeing the limits of your own expectations versus
Yeah.
somebody else taking up your system. and
Most of my
exploring it.
game-related emotions are now involved watching people play League of Legends.
Well-
Watching Cloud9 lose League of Legends is the most emotionally intense experience I've had recently. Yeah, in the back?
Thank you for coming and speaking and all your
Well, it sounds like a wrap-up.
Hey, thank you.
I love it.
Thanks for your thanks.
So, one thing that really struck me during your talk was when you started talking about the parallel emotions of avoidance and attraction.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately I thought of David Cronenberg's, basically his entire career, all
Yeah, okay.
like gruesome, disgusting.
Yes.
Especially I thought of Crash,
Mhm.
where like there are scenes in that movie where you want to like get up and run.
Yeah.
But you sit and you're like pacing through the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of any examples in games that do anything close to that? I mean, the closest I came to was like PT, if you played that. There were some parts, it's a playable trailer of a horror game,
Okay.
and there were some parts where like that door wasn't open a second ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really, like I do not want to go there,
Yep.
but I do.
Yeah.
Or like Manhunt is the most famous example of this, or yeah. So anything that you can think of where that intense kind of approach avoidance loop is.
Maybe the little sisters and having to make a decision about them, like
Yeah.
that sort of like, it's a cute kid, oh, it's repulsive, I should kill it, oh, I shouldn't, oh, you know, it just crystallized a really weird mix of approach and avoid is one that comes to
Yeah,
mind.
yeah.
But-
All right, let's do one more so we don't end on that image. Yeah.
Sorry.
I was interested about what you said earlier on about how some of the psychological science didn't really fit, didn't quite work,
Mhm.
found it hard to apply. And I was sort of reminded of James Paul Lee's book about learning literacy, which I really love.
Yep.
And how he looked at, and I looked at some of the existing educational studies where educators were trying to like isolate individual game features.
Yeah.
Somehow
Yeah.
create a learning outcome. So
Yes.
you had it a little more adventure, you could somehow get a better learning outcome. And I wonder, after reading Lee's book, I wonder if there's the same possibility here where instead game designers have like a fresh take on psychology,
Mhm.
maybe push it forward in that direction rather than trying to make the models perfect.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think I would add one thing, which is that it's about the analytics afterward, after you study the phenomenon? How do you analyze it? And most psych people use pretty old statistics to begin with. And so I think one interesting thing about games is how analytics is traveling alongside it. And I think that combination is going to result in really interesting new understanding of human behavior and psyche.
Awesome. Well, I think maybe we'll end it there. Catherine, thank you
Okay.
so much.
Yeah.
That was lovely.
Thank you.
Great talk. It's so good to see you again
Yes.
and hang out.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yay. Thanks, everybody.